Hello, everybody. First of all, can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, I want to apologise. I've got a bit of a cough, so if I start spluttering, I do apologise. But I'm thinking maybe if we think of it as a sort of a viral sonic intervention, that could be a useful way of thinking about it for my presentation. Okay. So, yes, today's presentation is called How to Do Things with Sounds, or is it the sounding of sound matter that matters? Sorry. Yes, sorry. Oh, no. Thanks. Oh, sorry. So today, my presentation is going to come in three sections, which I'm calling articulations. They're basically all connected. It's like a triptych, if you think about it that way. But the first one is called articulations with found footage and anecdotes. But before I get going, I've got some pencils, which I'd like to hand around. So if I pass them, you can hand them around and thank you. So as you can see, the pencils have all got a piece of paper wrapped around them. I'd ask you just to take a pencil, pass it on and keep it. Don't unwrap the paper or look at it just yet. I'll tell you when I'd like you to do that in a little while. In the meantime, while you hand them around, I've just got a little bit of a video to show. I often use short clips of vintage comedy, such as Jacques Tati or Laurel and Hardy, within my lectures and presentations. After all, the comedic is a very potent device for provocation. I find that using unexpectedly lowbrow references in conjunction with critical theory and academic texts is an effective way to set a particular tone for the performed elements that may follow. A primer or ground over which the content of my presentation proper is laid. And in a very, very minor way, it acts... Okay, right. And in a very... Can we turn it up a little bit so I don't have to be so close? Is that possible? Thanks. Anyway, and in a very minor way, I've lost my thread. It acts to subvert or at least challenge the more conventional structure of this symposium or colloquium. Applying humour where it is unexpected, thank you, or uninvited is a noise of sorts. In communication theory, unexpected input and disturbance can be found to help improve the signal strength. Also, in regards my use of such clips, a great deal of my practice concerns both the performative examination of sound and the technological mediation of such via moving image. And what's more, I just really like the stuff. Although for this particular presentation, I had not intended to use a clip of this type, as it didn't really seem relevant. However, last week, something occurred to make me change my mind. I found myself for the first time leafing through Maurizio Boscagli's Stuff Theory, Everyday Objects, Radical Materialism, 2014. Imagine my delight when I came across a number of references to the films of Jacques Tati. The sonic qualities of Tati's work have, of course, been discussed before. Here I'm thinking of, in particular, Michel Chion's small book, The Films of Jacques Tati, 2002. But to find these cinematic oddities being surveyed through the lens of both new and historical materialism was, for me, a significant serendipity. In his book, he talks of the materiality within Tati films, saying that, quote, "This stuff could hardly affect change, but it could invade the sleek spaces and in them sound the jarring note to incite it," end quote. So it is in this respect that I decided to use this comedy clip primer as an inciter. The character in this short excerpt, Playtime 1967, both sonically enables his environment and is enabled by it. His engagement with the resistant materials that populate his immediate surroundings is both a subject and an object. Pascali defines stuff as, quote, "an assemblage of quasi-objects and quasi-subjects, forms, flows and events that supersede the objects as it has been defined. It points to a matter that is continually becoming, through an increasing production of contact zones, an increasing crisscrossing of flows of power that continually and necessarily compromise its individual identity," end quote. I would like to extend an expanded definition of materiality beyond the object to the amorphous and fugitive material of sound. Sound matter is not the dumb, mute, irrational stuff of which human acts. Rather, it is a relational sonic stuff. To quote Christoph Cox from his essay Sonic Philosophy 2013, sound then affirms an ontology of the flux, in which objects are merely temporal concretions of fluid processes. This flux ontology replaces objects with events, end quote. It is such a materiality of sound that I use in positing a shared ontology between the sonic and the performative. This brings me to my second articulation, where I outline the provenance and reasoning behind my conceptual repurposing of the motivations shared, at least in part, by such as speculative realism and new materialism. Here I would like to introduce my idea of a deed-oriented ontology of the sonic. My neologism, deed-oriented ontology, is stimulated by the rather loose, messy and masculine field of philosophy, object-oriented ontology, which is also known by its accepted acronym OOO. Object-oriented thinkers denounce correlationism, a term coined, which has already been mentioned a number of times, by the French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux to describe a view that holds that being exists only as a correlate between mind and world. Correlationism holds that humans and the world are inexplicably tied together. One never exists without the other. Broadly speaking, these philosophical and theoretical fields are consolidated in their hostility to the anthropocentric. In regards artistic and curatorial responses to this declaration of anti-correlationism, Cox, Jaski and Malik state in their introduction to Realism, Materialism, Art 2015 that, quote, "Such claims accord well with modern and contemporary art's long-standing interest in the limitations of human perceptual and linguistic conditions of understanding," end quote. The use of object-oriented philosophies by practitioners frequently manifests itself in works that examine technological mediations and the way that humans perceive objects, assigning a kind of agency to objects, even ascribing quasi-human characteristics to non-human beings. This is considered to be problematic by Cox and Dahl, as by applying the expanded notion of object proposed by OOO to material things, quote, the practitioners have unwittingly and ironically reversed OOO, extending correlationism to the specifically material and otherwise inert objects, end quote. So I realise that in support of the speculation that I am calling deed-oriented ontology, there are rather a lot of philosophical and theoretical fields and massive isms and ologies that perhaps need to be examined more fully. To do this, I will apply one such ironic reversal of OOO by employing the assistance of Google. Google, what is speculative realism?
According to Wikipedia, speculative realism is a movement in contemporary philosophy which defines itself loosely in its stance of metaphysical realism against the dominant forms of post-Kantian philosophy.
To elaborate on that slightly, speculative realism is believed to have taken its name from a conference held in Goldsmiths College, University of London in April 2007. It is a movement in contemporary philosophy that defines itself loosely in its stance against the belief that all existence is reducible to the human experience of existence. Speculative realism is described as, quote, opposing the formally ubiquitous modern dogma that philosophy can speak only of the human world relation rather than the world itself. Speculative realism defends the autonomy of the world from human access, but in a spirit of imaginative audacity, end quote. Google, what is object-oriented ontology?
According to Wikipedia, object-oriented ontology is a school of thought that rejects the privileging of human existence over the existence of non-human objects.
Although this is no doubt a simplification, the origins of OOO can be traced through the umbrella term speculative realism. OOO construes a flat ontology, a term originally coined by writer, artist and philosopher Manuel Delande. To say a knowledge is flat is to make no distinction between types of things that exist, but to treat them all equally. The flattening that OOO affords can be extended even further. To quote Graham Harman, the exact meaning of objects must include those entities that are neither physical nor even real. Along with diamonds, rope, neutrons, objects may include armies, monsters, square circles, end quote. This is useful as it facilitates my consideration of events as objects. OOO collapses any idea of identity beyond what is manifest in given relational schemes. OOO holds any relationship between objects is a generative identity, translating and/or distorting. I reinterpret this generating to be a doing, and as such a performative and/or a performance, an event of embodied thinking. In alien phenomenology, what it's like to be a thing, Ian Bogost adopts Harman's usage, stating that object-oriented thinking involves the revelation of objects' relationship without necessarily offering descriptions or classifications of any kind. Quote, it can take the form of a compendium, a record of things juxtaposed to demonstrate their overlap and implying interaction through calculation, end quote. It is in this quote that a clue might be found as to the structure of my presentation today. Bogost goes on to say, quote, it is our job to amplify the noise of objects. Our job is to write the speculative fiction of their processes, end quote. Here he is referring to the job of the philosopher, but I extend this statement to stuff and materials and practices. Google, what is new materialism?
According to Millennium, Journal of International Studies, The new materialism is the most common name given to a series of movements in several fields that criticize anthropocentrism, rethink subjectivity by playing up the role of unhuman forces within the human, emphasize the self-organizing powers of several non-human processes, explore dissonant relations between those.
New materialism can be said to concern a series of questions and potentialities that revolve around the idea of active agential stuff. New materialists' practice tends to promote models of immanent and continuously emerging relationality even. A dominant feature of new materialism is its demand that matter is recognised as having its own focus of resistance and productivity. Matter is vital and vibrant, to paraphrase the title of the well-known book by theorist Jane Bennett, in which he sets forth a political agency of the non-human. New materialism is a category of theories that were generated as responses to the linguistic turn, infused with commitments to specific knowledge becoming practices and a history linked to feminism. New materialism attempts to offer a different perspective to signification, materiality and methodologies of crafting knowledge. New materialism, along with a number of other recent developments in theory and philosophy such as non-representational theory, can be defined as knowing becoming practice. Google, what is non-representational theory?
According to Wikipedia, non-representational theory is a theory developed in human geography, largely through the work of Nigel Thrift and his colleagues such as J.D. Dewsbury and Derek McCormack, and indeed, later, by their respective graduate students who have pushed non-representational thinking in various empirical registers.
Knowledge becoming practices refers to the way that new materialists think about things in the world and what we know about them. Historically, ontology, what is in the world, and epistemology, what we know about the world, were considered to be separate and not affecting each other. What new materialists point out is that what is in the world and what we know about what is in the world cannot be considered to be different things. What is in the world and what we know about things in the world are constantly shaping one another. So now I'd like you to unravel the bit of paper off your pencils and read it, please, if you would. And just consider it for a few seconds. Yeah. Okay. This mutable amalgamation of the aforementioned theories in the development of what I call deed-oriented ontology of the sonic moves the relational within these concepts to centre stage. I selectively take from object-oriented philosophies to create a thinking that is disposed towards event and emergence rather than thingness. Despite my practice prioritising the process of doing over the product, the expanded object is very much an actant within my research. Let us remember that actants, according to Bruno Latour, are anything that modifies other actors through a series of actions. In my practice, actants both do and are done too. Performative objects are not passive, but affect sounding and being sounded. How then does this affect and effect the non-thing of sound, the vibrant nothingness of audio? OOO's endless list of equitable objects must also include sonic events. I would perhaps style my deed-oriented ontology as more of a meta-schema than a theory proper. I would equate it to something akin to non-representational theory, in that non-representational theory is a mosaic of theoretical ideas borrowed from fields as different and diverse as performance studies, material cultural studies, contemporary continental philosophy, and many more. Non-representational theory concerns itself with practice and action, and as such it is predominantly a theory of research. If indeed there is a quintessential non-representational style, then it is that of becoming entangled in relations and objects rather than studying their structure and symbolic meaning. This reconsideration of what I regard to be an object within my practice has raised certain questions. How does my methodology alter if I include such event-centric systems as repetition or such concepts as subjectivity within my classification of objects? It is in this respect that my practice-led research takes epistemological methodology from such as non-representational theory and, to a certain degree, new materialism. Attention to practice and everyday life is closely tied to notions of performance and performativity. And in actual fact, my deed-oriented ontology is a slight deceit, as although it incorporates the term ontology, it is not an ontology proper. Rather, it could be considered to be a user manual for somatic thinking, doing about sound. The French philosopher François Rouel has a concept of non-philosophy or non-standard philosophy. For me, this is a very useful concept. It proposes the use of philosophy as a material instead of as a form of commentary or a framing device. Professor John O'Malarkey refers to this non-philosophical orientation as not leading to philosophy becoming art in some reductive merger, or art becoming philosophy as its mere illustrator, but rather than both standing as equals, both thinking equally, both samples of the real. So perhaps deed-oriented non-ontology or deed-oriented non-standard ontology might be a more appropriate neologism, although then I would lose my acronym DOO, which of course makes reference to the action of performing in the present tense. It is possible to denigrate some theories that are based around so-called new materialisms as animistic, and indeed one could accuse certain advocates of fetishizing matter. Despite intentions to the contrary, many new materialist gestures may actually amplify the boundary between nature culture and matter signification. In contemporary art practices, these tendencies may correspond with moves against conceptualism, inasmuch as it is a language and text-based approach. I consider this returning to matter to interrogate immanent properties of materials, be those materials haptic, ocular or sonic, to be a useful tool for my research. However, it is also troublesome as it is at odds with the performative as it features within my practice. It is perhaps this paradoxical, reflexive, human decentering of the human that is of most interest to me. The origins of performativity are born of social constructivism that repunks new materialism. My deed-oriented ontology shifts the emphasis to a performative materialism. I'm aware that this is not only incompatible with many new materialist theories, but also sacrilegious to the object-oriented ontologist. This incompatibility is paramount in my ongoing definition of sonic deed. To quote Nietzsche, the doer is only a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything, end quote. Object-oriented philosophers state very clearly that everything is an object. Let's not forget Harman's monsters and square circles. So then we must include sound, events, performativity, non-philosophy, tautology, comedy. In the moving of the materialities of sound practice via the focus set by such as OOO, how would it be if we also embrace the very thing that OOO rejects? If the idealism that OOO rails against as evident in such as representation, context, textuality, discourse, subjectivity, and so on, were to be merged into this endless category of objects, then surely this would produce the flattest of possible ontologies. I would exchange the term sound art for sounding arts to highlight the performative materialism that I have already identified. In conclusion, sound has the potential to form a thinking and as a practice a kind of doing thinking. To borrow a term from Brian Masumi, the thinking feeling of sound is causal and as such, rather than just spectate, the sonic articulates and participates. To expand upon this quote, thinking feeling is a thinking of perception in perception in the immediacy of its occurrence as it is heard, end quote. So in regards to what exactly is a deed-oriented ontology of the sonic and the performative practice that it accentuates, if anything, it may be akin to an onto-epistemic doing. I borrow the term onto-epistemology from the feminist theorist Karen Barad. Barad's agential realism is at once a knowing being. And lastly, the non, as a prefix to both representation and philosophy, expresses an absence which need not incorporate negativity. The use of non as a tool of criticality and pedagogy can be thought as an opening up of a particular subject, not a nullifying or closing down. Rather than a disciplined specificity of sound art, we perhaps would be better to embrace it as a non-discipline, one explored through nonsense. Google, what is deed-oriented ontology?
According to Wikipedia, a deed-oriented ontology of the sonic is not intended as an ontology proper, or indeed a true philosophy. Rather, it should be understood as a user manual for somatic thinking. It takes from the concept of non-standard philosophy, as material, to take this terminology to an absurdist extreme. It is a non-onto-epistemic practice.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's we have some time for some questions. I'm continuing up here. Okay. Any questions?
Thanks, Kevin. It was very, very, very inspiring. I think.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice of you.
Well, maybe it's just a sort of a clarifying thing about the onto-epistemological thing you mentioned here towards the end.
Yeah.
Could you say just a little bit more about how this deed-oriented ontology connects to the thinking of Kevin Logan?
Yeah, only a little, because to be honest, I'm not a massive expert on Karen Barat's work, but again, it's this which is very much related to the previous presentation. It's this idea of practice and theory being completely part of the same thing. So I mean, there being no divide. One being practice being theoretical, theory being practical. And a way of learning through practice and practicing through learning in very simplistic terms. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the very interesting talk and performance. I was curious to know why you didn't make reference to the Marxist tradition or post-Marxist materialisms. I think particularly with respect to the idea of a deed-oriented ontology, at least a sort of kind of practical critical materialism found in as early as Marx's theses on Feuerbach, for example. I think Karen Barad was an interesting reference as well that you brought in at the end, but I'm thinking, for example, with speculative realism, that sort of problem between thinking and doing seems to very clearly leave out sort of the problem of doing that was so central to Marx and the Marxist tradition. So I thought another interesting part of your presentation was how you sort of had this much earlier form of, you could say, sound mediation in the form of scores with these kind of object performances. But just thinking about philosophically, it might enrich your project to sort of have this deeper historical engagement with earlier forms of materialism.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, to an extent, I think earlier forms of materialism, via Marxism, Althusen, etc. I think they go as being almost unspoken within new materialism, or for my reading of new materialism. So I don't necessarily think it's that useful to be that backward looking. In my own practice, I mean, this is very much something that's about my practice. It's not. This is why I kept on trying to make it quite clear that although I'm using this term ontology, it's not really an ontology. It's more of a practice manual, so to speak. So this idea of the very social aspect of Marxism and materialism, although it's interesting, it's politics with a big P, and I'd like to think if politics it features in my practice, which it sort of does, but it's more with a small p, if you know what I mean. And like the use of the word event, quite often in philosophy, such as Zizek, etc. The event is this big world changing sort of thing, and my problem with that is, for me, the event, where I'm using it, is this sort of smaller, more intimate, perhaps more like a Brian Masumi sort of thing, perhaps. No?
Kevin, I wonder if you had any thoughts about Harman's continued expansion of this concept of the object to an ever larger entity. I think his latest publication, he's dealing with the Dutch East India Company, and writing a kind of colonial history.
Okay.
And it's hard, I find, it's hard to envisage such a dominant and large entity as having the same status as the objects that he initially writes about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with the writing you're talking about, but I do. I mean, like I said, one thing that interests me about Harman, and I'm not. Hopefully, it came across that there is some criticism of object-oriented ontology, but I love the idea of anything being an object. I love the idea of a square circle being an object. For me, it's very interesting in terms of performance, a way of bracketing a performance practice. So yeah, I mean, I don't know about the East India Company being an object, but I think if repetition can be an object, or comedy can be an object, I don't really see why the East Indian Company can't be one either, to be honest.
I had one question,
Okay.
because I was wondering how you see the practices of your presentation and the presentation of the practices of Morten and Marie. How are they similar, or are there differences? Can you comment on that? Maybe Morten can also comment, or Marie.
Well, I think they were very similar. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's very. Very like the use of technology obviously is one big difference, but they're really superficial differences. I think. I mean, I don't want to make large comments about their practice, because that's all I've ever seen. But it seems that we're both exploring this thing of how one does theory. So yeah, I would say they seem very similar. Yeah. Maybe they'd like to say something about that?
Maybe. I don't know.
No?
Any response? No.
Maybe not.
It seems to me to be a key part of the question of ontology, right? So it could be interesting to have a wider discussion, maybe later or during our air intake to discuss further what the status of that practice and the differences perhaps.
Yeah, thank you for your performance as well. I really liked it too. Maybe to go off of that a little bit is maybe to talk a bit about the knowledge production you gain, maybe just personally and not in a larger institutional context, but for yourself when you're doing these, when you're, I guess, preparing for a performance or doing your research in general. Because I find that there's some similarity with doing research on any topic to the sort of constant, the humor, you're building up your sort of very idiosyncratic way of looking at what you're reading and picking something out and collecting. Yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, I think this is what I find really interesting is that I think it is. I think somebody said the word expanded is used too much in these sort of conferences, but I'd like to say it is an expanded form of research. And I mean, for example, I'm probably not even answering your question, but for example, yesterday I spent about an hour going around different shops to find a water bottle that was noisy enough, because for me, unfortunately, in Denmark, we make good quality water bottles, whereas in England they make really, really crap, very brittle ones that are really crunchy. And so that was research. It may not be sort of PhD research going out crunchy water bottles, but it was a very, and it's something that I would probably not do in any other walk of life, perhaps. Probably didn't answer your question then.
I hear you talk quite humorous, and I wanted to know a little bit how say humorous or sarcastic did you mean it?
I wouldn't say sarcastic, no, I mean, I'm not, because that's the lowest form of wit, as we all know. But no, I mean that's why I started off with the Tati footage, because just to sort of bracket what was going to follow in, put it in a particular context. But I mean, I do think like I said at the beginning, I think the comedic can be really interesting, and comedy has always been used politically, should we say. I mean, the whole thing of like slapstick was always like the little man winning out over, if you look at Charlie Chaplin, it's Charlie Chaplin winning out over Taylorism or, Fordism or whatever you want to call it. So it has always had like a political and in that respect sort of a philosophical bent to it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think I will say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.